To understand the medieval world, you have to understand its view of death. And to understand that, you have to start with God. Faith was not a part of life. It was life. The Christian church was the ultimate authority on everything, from how to plant crops to what happened when you took your last breath. And what happened, they said, was a judgment. Life on earth was a brief, often miserable test. It was a pilgrimage. Your real life, your eternal life, began after you died. This earthly existence was just the waiting room. The whole point was to get through it without failing the test so you could get to the good part. Death wasn't an end. It was a transition. It was the most important moment of your life. The soul was everything. The body was just a temporary shell, a vessel made of clay that would rot and return to dust. The soul, however, was immortal. It was the part of you that God would judge. When you died, your soul left your body and went to face its creator. This was the particular judgment, an immediate personal accounting of your life. Every sin, every good deed was weighed on a scale. Based on that judgment, your soul had a few possible destinations. The first was heaven. This was the goal. It was eternal paradise, a place of pure joy in the presence of God. To get there, you had to die in a state of grace. This meant you had confessed your sins, received absolution, and had a true love for God in your heart. The saints, the martyrs, and the truly pious went directly to heaven. For the average person, though, this was a high bar. Most people knew they weren't perfect. The second destination was hell. This was the ultimate failure. Hell was eternal torment, a place of fire and despair, completely cut off from God. It was reserved for those who died with mortal sins on their souls. A mortal sin was a serious offense, like murder or blasphemy, committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. If you died without repenting for such a sin, you were damned. Forever. The fear of hell was a powerful motivator. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a real physical place that preachers described in terrifying detail. But there was a third option, and this third option shaped the medieval relationship with death more than anything else. It was purgatory. Purgatory was a place of temporary punishment and purification. It was for souls who died in a state of grace but were not yet perfect enough to enter heaven. They still had lesser or venial sins to account for, or they hadn't fully paid the price for mortal sins that had already been forgiven through confession. Purgatory was a place of suffering, often described with fire just like hell. But there was one crucial difference. Purgatory was temporary, it had an exit, everyone in purgatory was eventually going to heaven. They just had to be cleansed first. This belief in purgatory created a powerful connection between the living and the dead. A soul's time in purgatory could be shortened. The prayers of the living could help the dead. Your family and friends had a job to do after you died. They could pray for your soul. They could have masses said in your name. They could give alms to the poor on your behalf. All these actions could reduce your sentence in that fiery waiting room. This meant death was not a final separation. The community of the church included the living, the saints in heaven, and the souls in purgatory. They were all connected. The dead depended on the living, and the living had a profound duty to the dead. This wasn't just a nice idea, it was a spiritual transaction. It was a core belief that drove people's actions. Rich men would leave money in their wills to found chantries, chapels where a priest was paid to do nothing but say mass for their soul, day after day, for years. This was an insurance policy for the afterlife, so the moment of death was critical. Everything depended on the state of your soul when it left your body. A good death was one where you were prepared. You had time to reflect on your life. You could make a final confession to a priest. You could receive the last rites, the final sacraments of the church. This cleaned the slate. It prepared you for your meeting with God. A sudden death, an unprepared death, was terrifying. To be struck down by an arrow in battle, or to fall from a horse, or to die in your sleep without a final confession was a spiritual catastrophe. It meant you might face judgment with unconfessed sins on your soul. This whole system, this spiritual map of the afterlife, was the foundation. It explained why death was so public, so ritualized, and so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. It wasn't something to be hidden away, it was the final exam, and everyone had to be ready for it. Death was not an abstract concept in the Middle Ages. It was a constant companion. People lived with death in a way that is hard for us to imagine today. It was familiar, visible, and unavoidable. Life was fragile, and everyone knew it. Life expectancy was short. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, but many didn't even make it that far. Childhood itself was a perilous journey. A huge number of children died before their 5th birthday. parents expected to lose children. They had many, and they hoped some would survive. A disease was a constant threat. A small cut could become infected and kill a strong man. A winter flu could wipe out a village. There was no understanding of germs, no antibiotics, no modern medicine. People relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and superstition. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. Every pregnancy was a life-threatening event. Then there was famine. A bad harvest meant starvation. A drought or a flood could destroy the food supply for an entire region. People would eat grass, roots, and tree bark to survive. Hunger weakened the population, making them even more vulnerable to disease. The specter of starvation was always present. War and violence were also part of the landscape. Feuds between lords, raids by bandits, and larger wars meant that violent death was common, especially for men. Public executions were a form of entertainment and a stark reminder of the law. People would gather to watch hangings, beheadings, or even more brutal punishments. The bodies were often left on display for days as a warning. Because death was so frequent, it was also very public. There were no hospitals or funeral homes in the modern sense. People died at home, surrounded by their family and neighbors. The whole community was involved. When someone died, the church bells would toll, announcing the death to everyone in the parish. The body would be washed and wrapped in a simple shroud by the women of the family. It would then lie in the house for a week, where friends and family would come to pray and pay their respects. Burial happened quickly, usually within a day or two. Cemeteries weren't located on the outskirts of town. They were the churchyards, right in the center of the community. People walked through them every day on their way to church or the market. Graves were often not permanent. A family might pay for a plot, but for most people, burial was in a common unconsecrated part of the churchyard. The ground was used over and over. When a new grave was dug, the bones from previous burials would be unearthed. These bones were then collected and stored in a charnel house, a building or vault on the church grounds. Skulls and bones were often stacked neatly, visible to all. This wasn't seen as disrespectful. It was a practical solution to limited space and a powerful reminder that everyone, rich or poor, ended up as a pile of bones. The greatest demographic shock of the Middle Ages was the Black Death. The plague that swept through Europe in the mid-14th century was a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. It killed a third to a half of the entire population in just a few years. In some towns, the death toll was much higher. Entire villages were wiped out. The Black Death changed everything. It amplified all the existing realities of death. It was sudden, unstoppable, and horrifying. People would go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. Priests died, leaving no one to give the last rites. Gravediggers died, leaving no one to bury the dead. The sheer number of bodies was overwhelming. The old rituals broke down. Instead of individual burials in the churchyard, massive plague pits were dug outside the city walls. Bodies were thrown in, layer upon layer, with a sprinkling of dirt in between. This constant, overwhelming presence of death shaped the medieval mindset. It fostered a sense of fatalism. God's will was seen in everything, and if it was your time to die, it was your time. But it also created a deep spiritual urgency. If life could end at any moment without warning, then you had to be prepared at all times. You had to keep your soul in a state of grace. You couldn't afford to put off confession. The randomness and suddenness of death made the need for a good life and a prepared soul all the more pressing. It wasn't that they were morbid or obsessed with death. They were realistic. In a world so full of uncertainty, the state of your soul was the one thing you could try to control. Death was a fact of life, as common and as natural as birth. Because the moment of death was so important, a whole culture developed around how to die well. It wasn't enough to live a good life. You also had to die a good death. This process was so crucial that it was eventually written down in guidebooks. These were called the Ars Moriendi, which is Latin for the art of dying. These books, which became very popular in the 15th century, were practical manuals for the dying and for those attending them. They laid out a kind of spiritual battlefield that took place at the deathbed. As a person lay dying, their soul was at its most vulnerable. Demons would arrive to tempt them one last time, trying to drag them down to hell at the final moment. But angels would also be there, helping the dying person resist. The Ars Moriendi described 5 main temptations. The first was the temptation against faith. The demon would suggest that perhaps everything the church taught was a lie. He would try to make the dying person doubt God's existence or his mercy. The second temptation was to despair. The demon would list all the person's sins, trying to convince them that they were unforgivable and that they were surely damned. This was a direct attack on the hope of salvation. The third temptation was impatience. A long, painful illness could wear down the spirit. The demon would encourage the dying person to complain, to curse God for their suffering, and to lose their composure. The fourth was vainglory or spiritual pride. If the person had lived a good life, the demon would tempt them to be proud of it. He would whisper that they had earned their way into heaven through their own merits, a dangerous thought that diminished the need for God's grace. Finally, there was the temptation of avarice, or attachment to worldly things. The demon would remind the dying person of their family, their home, their money, trying to make them cling to their earthly life instead of turning their soul toward God. For each temptation, the Ars Moriendi offered a counter-argument, a source of comfort provided by a guardian angel. Against doubt, the angel would remind them of the steadfastness of the saints. Against despair, the angel would point to the mercy of Christ, who died for all sinners. Against impatience, the angel encouraged them to see their suffering as a way to imitate Christ's suffering on the cross. Against vainglory, the angel reminded them that all good things come from God. And against avarice, the angel urged them to entrust their loved ones to God's care and to detach from the material world. The ideal death was a calm, conscious, and deliberate process. It was a public performance with the dying person as the main actor. The person would be in their own bed at home. They would be surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors. A priest would be present. The dying person would take control of the scene. They would forgive anyone who had wronged them and ask for forgiveness from those they had wronged. They would give their final blessings to their children. They would make a final, thorough confession of their sins to the priest. Then they would receive the last rites. This included viaticum, the final reception of the Eucharist, seen as food for the journey into the afterlife. It also included extreme unction, the anointing of the sick with holy oil, which was meant to strengthen the soul for its final struggle. The perfect death involved a conscious acceptance of God's will. The person would willingly embrace their death, not as an end, but as a homecoming. Their final words would be of faith and piety, perhaps repeating the name of Jesus or Mary. They would die peacefully with a look of serenity. This was the model, the death that everyone hoped for. Of course, not everyone got to die this way. The opposite of the good death was the bad death, the mors mala. This was a death that was sudden and unprepared. To be killed in a tavern brawl, to be struck by lightning, to fall from a roof, or to die alone in a field was a spiritual disaster. There was no time for confession, no time for the last rites, no time to say goodbye. The soul was caught off guard. This was the great fear. The art of dying was therefore also an art of living. Since death could come at any time, one had to live in a state of constant readiness. You had to keep your accounts with God in order. The elaborate rituals of the deathbed were the final act in a life lived with the awareness of its own end. It was about finishing well. The Ars Moriendi wasn't just for the dying. It was a reminder to the living that they, too, would one day face this final test, and they had better be prepared. Death did not sever the relationship between a person and their community. In many ways, it deepened it. The period after death was filled with rituals designed to honor the deceased, comfort the living, and, most importantly, help the soul on its journey through purgatory. The living had a job to do. Once a person was confirmed to be dead, the family took over. The body was treated with respect, as it had been the temple of the soul. The eyes and mouth were closed. The body was washed, often with herbs and spices if the family could afford it. Then it was dressed in a simple linen shroud. For most people, there was no coffin. Coffins were an expensive luxury reserved for the very wealthy or high-ranking clergy. The shrouded body was placed on a bier, a simple wooden frame, and laid out in the main room of the house. This began the wake. Candles were lit around the body to ward off evil spirits. Family, friends, and neighbors would gather in the house. This was a time for mourning, but it was also a time for prayer. The people at the wake would recite psalms and prayers for the soul of the departed. The main purpose was to begin the work of easing their path through purgatory. The wake was a social and a spiritual event, a way for the community to show solidarity with the grieving family and to fulfill their duty to the dead. The funeral procession was the next step. The body was carried from the home to the parish church. The procession itself was a public statement. A poor person might be carried on the bier by a few family members. A rich person's funeral would be a grand spectacle. There would be paid mourners, professional women who would wail and cry to display the family's grief. There would be people carrying torches and banners with the family's coat of arms. The number of priests and monks in the procession was also a sign of status. The procession moved through the streets and the church bells would toll again, calling the whole community to prayer. At the church, a Requiem Mass was celebrated. This was the central ritual. The Mass was specifically for the dead, asking God to grant them eternal rest and to forgive their sins. The name Requiem comes from the first line of the Latin prayer, Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. The body would be present in the church, a stark reminder of mortality. The smoke from the incense and the solemn chants of the choir filled the air. After the Mass came the burial. The body was carried out to the churchyard. The priest would bless the grave with holy water. As the body was lowered into the earth, he would say the final prayers, committing the body to the ground and the soul to God. The phrase ashes to ashes, dust to dust comes from this burial service. For most, this meant being placed directly into the earth, wrapped only in their shroud. Later, the bones might be dug up and moved to a charnel house to make room for others. The idea of a private, permanent grave for every person was not the norm, but the work was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. The belief in purgatory meant that the living had an ongoing obligation. A single Requiem Mass was good, but more was better. Families would arrange for Masses to be said on the 3rd, 7th, and 30th days after the death, and again on the 1-year anniversary. These were considered particularly effective times for prayer. Those with money could do much more. They could leave bequests in their will to the church, to monasteries, or to the poor. These charitable acts were believed to generate spiritual merit that could be applied to their soul. The ultimate investment was the chantry. A wealthy person could endow a chantry chapel, paying for a priest whose sole job was to say Mass for their soul, and perhaps the souls of their family, every single day. This was a way to ensure that the prayers would not stop when the immediate family had forgotten or died themselves. It was a perpetual prayer machine for the afterlife. The community of the dead was remembered collectively as well. The church calendar included All Souls' Day on November 2nd. This was a day dedicated to praying for all the faithful departed, especially those in purgatory who might have no one left to pray for them. The living would visit the graves of their loved ones, leave offerings, and attend special masses. This reinforced the idea of a single, unified church that spanned the divide between life and death. Remembering the dead was a fundamental part of medieval life. It was a duty, a social obligation, and an act of love. It was rooted in the practical theology of purgatory. The dead were not gone. They were just in another place, and they needed help. The living, through their rituals and prayers, provided that help, maintaining the bonds of family and community long after a person's body was in the grave. The medieval world was saturated with images of death. Far from hiding it away, they put it on display. They painted it on church walls, carved it into tombs, and wrote about it in poems. This art was not meant to be simply morbid or frightening. It had a clear purpose. It was a constant public service announcement with a single message, memento mori. Remember, you will die. This was not a depressing message. It was a call to action. Because your time on earth was short and your eternal fate was at stake, you had to live every day with that reality in mind. The imagery of death was a tool for spiritual focus. It was meant to shock people out of their complacency and remind them of what truly mattered. One of the most powerful and popular themes was the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. This image, which appeared in paintings, murals, and woodcuts, showed death as a series of animated skeletons. But these skeletons were not just menacing figures, they were dancing, and they were leading a procession of living people to their graves. The key feature of the Danse Macabre was its inclusivity. Death did not care about your social status. In the procession, you would see a skeleton gleefully grabbing the hand of a pope, a king, a bishop, and a knight. But right alongside them, other skeletons would be leading a peasant, a merchant, a child, and a young woman. Now, the message was unmistakable. Death is the great equalizer. Your wealth, your power, your beauty, none of it matters in the end. The dance unites everyone. The Pope in his finery is just as helpless as the beggar in his rags. This was a radical social commentary in a world that was rigidly hierarchical. It was a reminder to the powerful not to be arrogant and a strange sort of comfort to the poor, suggesting that the injustices of this world would be leveled out in the next. Another stark form of memento mori art was the transi-tomb, or cadaver tomb. These became popular among the wealthy and powerful in the late Middle Ages. A typical tomb for a nobleman or bishop would feature a life-size effigy of the deceased on tops, showing them in all their glory dressed in armor or fine robes, looking dignified and peaceful. But the transi-tomb had a shocking addition. Below this idealized effigy, on a lower level of the tomb, there would be another carving. This one showed the same person's body as it would look after death, a decaying corpse. This second carving was horrifically realistic. It would show an emaciated body, sometimes with the skin shriveled and torn, revealing the bones beneath. Worms and other creatures might be shown crawling over the corpse. The contrast between the two effigies was the whole point. Above, you see the worldly glory. Below, you see the grim reality of what the body becomes. It was a powerful statement on the vanity of earthly life. The person who commissioned the tomb was essentially saying, "See all my power and wealth. This is what it comes to. Do not be distracted by the things of this world. Remember your own mortality and prepare your soul." Skulls and skeletons were everywhere. They were used as symbols in paintings of saints, particularly those who had lived as hermits and contemplated the meaning of life and death. The skull became a shorthand for mortality. A scholar might be painted with a skull on his desk, to remind him that all his learning is nothing without spiritual wisdom. A beautiful woman might be shown looking in a mirror that reflects back a skull, a warning that her beauty is fleeting. This focus on the macabre was not about a love of horror. It was a form of spiritual discipline. By confronting the physical decay of the body, people were encouraged to focus on the eternal health of their soul. It was a way of fighting the temptation to get too comfortable, to attach to earthly pleasures and possessions. When you are constantly reminded that you will one day be a skeleton, you are less likely to put all your energy into accumulating gold or titles. The medieval view of death was a complete system. It started with a clear theological framework of heaven, hell, and purgatory. This framework was made real by the everyday experience of living in a world where life was fragile and death was a constant neighbor. In response, they developed a set of practices, the art of dying, to ensure a person was spiritually prepared for the end. After death, a rich tradition of rituals and prayers kept the dead connected to the living. And, finally, a powerful and public artistic tradition of memento mori served as a constant reminder to everyone about the finality of death and the urgency of salvation. It was a view that was at once terrifying and hopeful, grim and pragmatic. Death was an enemy, but it was also a doorway. And they spent their whole lives making sure they were ready to walk through it.